merciful, ever merciful. And may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Jafar. Dear respected brothers, sisters, and viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu ala al-Husayn wa ala Ali ibn al-Husayn wa ala awlad al-Husayn wa ala ashab al-Husayn. The theme for tonight's lecture is going to be a type of a second part to the lecture that we began yesterday, which is the broad theme of environmental ethics and the place of the human being in the world and the relationship between the human being and nature. But this time we want to add another dimension to it. We want to focus today on seeing how the discussion that we began and inshallah will continue and end today is going to allow us not only to understand those specific questions and those specific themes which we began and we started to address directly, but also start to understand a little bit of the relationship between the natural world and the supernatural world. So when we hear or see or get reports of things that seem to be breaking away with the laws of nature as we know them, we have better tools, we're better equipped to analyze what we're hearing and what we're seeing, what is being reported to us, so that we can better assess it. Do we simply dismiss? Do we simply accept? Or is it somewhere in between? The big questions that we started to look at, the first one has to do with the general theme of evil in the world, understanding why there are detrimental, harmful, evil things in the world, especially when they seem to be associated, they seem to be related to the natural component of the world. So natural disasters and disease and so on and so forth, which is different from talking about man-made evils. The second theme that we touched on, and inshallah the connections were clear enough from the discussion that we had, is trying to look at the notion of karma from an Islamic perspective. And the third notion that we looked at is the place of the human being in nature and the manner in which we are supposed to be using nature and how far that relationship goes. Does it go in one way or is it a two-way relationship? And what difference does it make whether I fold and I align myself with, let's say, religious teachings, spiritual teachings, or not? Does that have any impact on the relationship that I have with the natural world or not? So we're going to start by highlighting some of the points that we raised yesterday, and we're going to build on them to move from this discussion to the discussion on, to transition from here to the discussion on the supernatural. Some of the main points that we raised was, first, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when a human being has a blessing, anything that you interpret to be a good thing in your life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you as a principle, as a rule, that thing is never going to be removed away from you unless there is a change in you. If that blessing goes away, it is a direct result of your doing of your own actions. And we may think that we're reaching, as they say, we're over-interpreting some verses of the Quran. The verse is very clear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, that is because Allah never changes a blessing that He has bestowed on a people unless they change what is in themselves. I think that's clear enough. If a blessing has been given to you, then by default, that blessing is going to remain in place until you, and this is the reminder, you as an individual or you as a society, do something that makes that blessing go away. And this can work at so many levels. It could perhaps even work at our level today when we look around and we see, for instance, that we live without a prophet, a messenger, an imam among us. That's a huge blessing that has disappeared from us. We have done things as human beings, we have done things as people, as communities, as groups that has led to this consequence. But this also works at our level too. And it applies in things like health, money, knowledge, safety, whatever you may think of, you can see applications of this principle. And on the other side, so this is when you have a blessing and you don't want to lose it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, don't do anything that causes you to lose it. And on the other side, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you want a blessing that you don't have, if you want to improve your state, then you need to work, you need to transform, you need to improve yourself so that that comes to you. That's the opposite side of this verse. And we also have a verse that directly talks about this. It says that is because Allah will never change the state of a people until they change what is in themselves. So the first one says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never take away a blessing from a people that He has bestowed on a people unless they change something about themselves. This one says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never change, so we can interpret it as improve or as a general rule, both sides, unless they change something in themselves. The next point is, and I think this one has also become clear enough for us, we said everything that is in nature, everything that has been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always remain under the direct sovereignty, under the direct rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we may interpret this, and we're going to come back to these in more detail today inshallah. Sometimes we may interpret this in a symbolic or metaphorical way. But there are clear verses in the Quran that say, for instance, that everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created is in a state of prostration to Allah. Everything is in a state of sujood to Allah. Other verses say everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created is in a state of constant praise to Allah, but you don't understand their praise. And of course we have the more general verses that say to Allah belongs everything, and in other verses everyone that is in the heavens and the earth. And so this is the true form of ownership, of sovereignty, which means that for you to use those things, you need the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which He says, I have predisposed all those things to be used by you, but you need to be using them in the proper way. One way to put this is to say that you need to be fully aligned with the nature that I have put in you, which is your fitrah. You have to go back to the way you're supposed to be so that you can use everything that I have predisposed for you to be used the way it's supposed to be used. The more you can do that, the more things are going to be predisposed for you. One more point is that we said the relationship between you and your actions. So these actions that you're doing in this world, that you're putting into the world, this is a binding relationship. Binding in the sense that you're stuck with it. It's not something that happens and then it disappears. An act happened in a point in time and then it never happens again and that's it. No. Whatever you have put into the world is going to remain there. It's a lasting and it's a binding. It's binding in the sense that you're stuck with it and it's stuck with you. The good and the bad. And you see this in all sorts of ways in the Holy Quran. If we look, let's concentrate a little bit more on the good. You see it in this world and you see it in the next world. The next world, for instance, you have verses in the Quran that say, those who were pious and who did good in this world, who were righteous, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will gather to them, will regroup to them their progeny to enter with them in paradise. Why? It's as though the verse is saying that person that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to deal with in this manner has done such good things in their lives, has raised their family and the people around them in such a way that it created a lasting impression on the next generations after them. So the effects of their own acts are showing in 2, 3, 4, 10 generations later. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, even if those later generations are not as good as that person was, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will still gather them to them and bring them together in paradise in honor of that first person who started that trend. Allah will forgive and Allah will raise the rank of those people because someone in their ancestry did something so good that they deserved to be made happier in paradise by seeing everyone from their own progeny come with them in paradise. This is where you start seeing the lasting impression of what you do. Okay, so this is the afterlife, and this is the whole point, or one of the main points of yesterday's lecture. To stop making this distinction between the material world and the spiritual world. To see them together. So okay, this is the afterlife. What about this world? Where do we see the binding and the lasting effects? Multiple verses in the Quran talk about this, usually in forms of stories. One of the stories could be interpreted in this manner is the story of the cow in Surah Al-Baqarah. When Prophet Musa alayhi salam asks Bani Israel to slaughter a cow, and it's a supernatural event that he wants to show who killed someone, so the person to raise them back from the dead to say who killed them, they have to slaughter a specific cow. That's one story. I leave it at that so that I incite you to go and read it and look into the story. Let me tell you about another story. This one in Surah Al-Kahf. In Surah Al-Kahf, we have the famous story of one of the servants of Allah. The surah does not say who it is, but the commentators, the interpreters tell us that this is in fact a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we know under the name of Al-Khidr. Musa alayhi salam encounters him so that he may learn from him. And so he performs 3 acts. One of the acts that he performs is that he builds a wall. They keep walking, they reach a point where they find a lot of bricks that have fallen, and clearly there was a time when these bricks were actually a wall. But a lot of time has passed and these bricks have now fallen. The wall has been destroyed, but the bricks are still there. So Al-Khidr proceeds to build it. He rebuilds the wall. Musa alayhi salam does not understand what he's doing. So after the end of the story, Al-Khidr starts explaining what he did. All 3 acts. And so he explains why he built the wall. He says, as for the wall, it belonged to 2 boys orphaned in the city. So there are 2 boys, their father has passed away. Now they are orphans and they live in the city. Under this wall, there was a treasure belonging to them. Their father had been a righteous man, so your Lord desired that they should come of age and take out their treasure. The father is gone. The boys are now all alone in the world. They don't know that there's a treasure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants them to have. As a result of what? As a result of their father being a righteous man, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala engineered the world in a way that when the time is right, that wall is going to be there for them to come, because they know under a wall there's a treasure for them. Now that the wall is erected, they come and they can get their treasure. as a reward for the father. They haven't done anything. This is the long-lasting effect of your actions in this world. You do good, you are stuck with it. In certain verses of the Quran, it says, you're a hostage to whatever you do. كُلُّ نَفْسٍ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ رَهِينَةٌ. You're held hostage by your actions. Your soul, yourself, is held hostage to its actions in this world and the next. Except those who are righteous. إِلَّا أَصْحَابَ الْيَمِينِ. Those, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will unbind them. Because if they do bad deeds, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not necessarily want them to be stuck with those bad deeds. Now, if we want to go to the actions that you perform and you see the rewards of those actions or the benefits of those actions in this world, there are too many narrations and too many instances and too many examples to cite. We're told, for instance, that there's a man who came to the Holy Prophet and he was complaining that he did not have enough sustenance, he did not have enough rizq. So the Holy Prophet told him, why don't you start always ensuring that you're in a state of purity? So for us it would mean basically always make sure that you've performed your wudu. You wake up in the morning, perform your wudu. Every time you go to the washroom, perform your wudu. Remain in a state of wudu all the time. In a state of purity all the time. That's it. The man is asking about sustenance. He's asking about wealth and money and enough to provide for his family. The Holy Prophet tells him, remain in a state of wudu. That's it. Later the man was seen and his financial condition was a lot better. And when people asked him what has happened, he said, I only did what the Holy Prophet told me to do, which is remain in a state of wudu. Okay, so there are direct benefits. We may not know them. This is where you need religion. This is where you can do all the experiments and all the studies about how the world works. You'll never know about these laws that Allah has put in place. This is where you need religion. You need a prophet. You need a Quran to tell you. And for us, speaking of wudu, this is something perhaps that we can keep in mind. The blessings, the benefits of always remaining in a state of wudu. There are things like this, which is a direct impact that we see in our lives. But there's also a spiritual component to this. It simply requires a little bit of an awareness from us. There are a lot of people who ask, they're constantly asking, what do you need to do to become stronger, to become more disciplined so that you do not commit a sin? I don't want to commit the sin, but sometimes I get too weak. And so I lose that discipline and the sin happens and then I regret. But what can I do to become stronger in the first place? One trick that you can use is to use the wudu. When you perform the wudu, remind yourself that you're doing something sacred. And force yourself to always be in a state of wudu. And based on what we already said yesterday and what we're going to add today, inshallah, you have to understand that the water you're using for your wudu, this is now a sacred water. And you've performed a sacred act. You've changed your state to another state. You're now in a state of purity. You may not feel very different because you're not aware of it. You're not doing anything to make yourself aware of it, but you've actually changed your state when you've performed your wudu. All you need to do is to force yourself to remember that you have entered in another state. You've done something special and now you're in a state of purity. And that state of purity does not work. You cannot match that with performing a sin. You cannot make yourself in a state of purity and then go and engage in a sin. If you're performing the sin, it's because it's a moment of weakness. It's not because you want to defy God, right? So if you were to remember that you are actually in a state of purity, you've covered yourself in a water that has become holy, that has put you in a different state, And it's unbecoming of you in that state to engage in a sin. It's shameful. You're desecrating the holiness of the water and the act of wudu that you have performed. So anyways, this is a link to a spiritual topic. We thought we'd just mention it quickly. We have also many narrations, many reports that tell us that on the other side, if certain people perform certain acts, sins, that there are certain natural disasters that start appearing in society. We have specific narrations that say, if certain types of sins increase, there will be more earthquakes. If certain types of sins increase, there will be more, the narrations refer to them as more sudden death. Maybe today the interpretation of sudden death is a heart attack. If you look around in the society, you see that there's a lot more heart attacks than there were before. So those narrations are linking those types of acts with these types of natural disasters, let's refer to them. There could be illnesses, there could be natural disasters, there could be diseases, and so on and so forth. We have other narrations that tell us that if you do certain things or don't do certain things, it leads to tyrants becoming the rulers. And you create these types of societies we refer to as dictatorships. You're going to live under an oppressive regime because of certain types of sins that you have performed. For instance, if there's no one in society who does any amr bil ma'ruf or nahi anil munkar, enjoining good and forbidding evil. And so this is where you see the social responsibility. We have narrations that say there are acts that you can do, especially for those times when those narrations are being said for those types of cultures, where you see that they lived in deserts, they lived in very dry environments. They're taught that if you perform certain acts or certain prayers or invocations, you will get rain. And it's very interesting, there's a big philosopher by the name of Ibn Sina, and this is a huge fight that sometimes the scholars of theology have with the philosophers. They say they're not believers enough, they want to rely too much on reason. He has a very interesting passage in one of his philosophical works. For centuries, Ibn Sina was considered the top philosopher in the Islamic world, and whoever was the top philosopher in the Islamic world was the top philosopher in the world. In that passage he says, whoever amongst the philosophers wants to negate the effects of Salat al-Istisqa, there's a prayer that you perform asking Allah for rain. He says whoever negates the effects of Salat al-Istisqa, that prayer to make it rain, and claims to be a philosopher, they are a false philosopher. You would think that someone like him would say we're completely going to rely on the laws of nature. And he in fact has treatises on meteorology and other things. We have a very interesting narration from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam that I think most of us, if we understand and if we apply, I don't think someone can really believe and understand this hadith and can continue to live in the same way. He says, there are times when the believer, he's talking about a mu'min, he says al-mu'min, there are times when the believer asks in his prayer for something from Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala plans to provide, to answer that prayer at a certain time. And then that believer intends to sin. And then the answer is delayed. Your prayer was answered, but you intended to sin. You haven't sinned yet. And this is different from saying that if you sin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to punish you. This is not the punishment. This is the causal relationship between your state in this world and what's happening to you. You intended to sin, it's delayed the answer to a prayer. This is not you have sinned. If you have sinned, it's different. You're going to get punished for it. There's a punishment waiting for you. But this is intending to sin, it's going to delay So every time, if you remember this hadith, and you're about to sin, and you remember everything you have asked from Allah, everything that you have wished and hoped for, remember this hadith. Not for spiritual reasons. Put the spiritual reasons aside and put the thawab and iqab aside. Think about, your comfort and your luxury and your ease in this world. Just think about those things. As you're about to sin, remember that if you're intending to sin, it's going to delay the answer to one of your prayers. I don't see how anyone who keeps all of these things in mind can continue to live in the same way, or fails to see that there's a direct relationship between the acts and the intentions that you have and the manner in which this world that you live in is responding to you. I think by now the relationship should be very clear. And perhaps one way to summarize all of this is to go back to the verse of the Holy Quran that says, if you are grateful, and your Lord has declared that if you are grateful, I shall increase in your blessings. And on the other side, if you are not grateful, then my punishment is severe. This, I think, verse summarizes the entire discussion that we just had. And maybe a quick word about, the importance of coming to gatherings like these. One way to look at it is, I come here because I get thawab. And that's excellent, that's what you're supposed to think. But even if that is difficult for you to work with, the notion of thawab is not registering well, then at least keep in mind the discussion that we just had. You are, in your life, always, whatever step you're making, physically or metaphorically, whatever you're doing, whatever act you're engaging in, is a step towards the blessings and the mercy of Allah, or the wrath and away from the mercy of Allah. There's nothing in between. You're either walking towards heaven or hell. You're either walking towards God or not. And of course, there's an afterlife, and there's everything that we know about the afterlife, but now we've added another dimension, which is, and there's this world too. So when you're walking towards Allah in this world, there's also the benefits that you reap in this world, that will come to you in this world. And gatherings like these, definitely no one will ever say that you've walked towards hell or you've walked towards evil. This is a place where you remember Allah, and you remember Ahlul Bayt, and you remember the Quran. The more you attend places like these, the more you engage with them, the more you contribute to keeping them alive, the more you're contributing to your own blessings in this world. And people who are always in these types of gatherings, in this type of state, they know the blessings of these. They see them in their own families, they see them in their wealth, they see them in their knowledge, they see them in their security, and so on and so forth in this world. So this is just a side note that we use to move on to wrap up this topic. I think another point that is worth making here is that if we keep this whole discussion in mind, and I'm sure that many of you are constantly hearing nowadays and for the past few years about the importance of mental health, and how there's a mental health crisis, and everybody feels so overwhelmed, and there's just so much happening, and everyone is depressed, and there's anxiety and panic attacks, and people don't know how to deal with everything. The world is moving too fast, there's too much to do, too many things to know, and it's overwhelming. One attitude is to say that, yes, it is overwhelming, and you feel that you are constantly the recipient of all of these difficulties and whatever is happening in the world, and you cannot do anything about it, and you're the victim. So you just sit there being bombarded by all these difficulties and feeling sorry for yourself, and feeling depressed, and feeling anxiety and panic and overwhelming. Or you adopt this type of attitude. You adopt this type of point of view, perspective, that basically tells you you are empowered. What's happening in the world You are responsible for it. And if you want it to change, then you need to change it. Act. It's not passive. It's not you sit there and you receive. It's you act and you change what's there. It completely flips the equation. So for those of you looking for the mental health component of all of this, and we're not, of course, talking about people who have a chemical imbalance leading to depression. That's different. We're talking about the manner in which you manage your life. The manner in which you manage the issues that arise and what you need to do about them. If you keep this discussion in mind, I assure you that you're going to be feeling a lot more empowered, and you will feel accountable and responsible for whatever is waiting to happen, because you have a say in it. Your acts, your intentions, what you put out is what you will get back. So inshallah, this stays in mind as we move to transitioning to the next topic. The discussion that we've had was supposed to highlight that the world that we know, that we often imagine to be a material world entirely, completely dictated by the laws of nature, this world, is actually the two worlds at the same time. The second world being the spiritual world. If everything we said is true, then it means that those things that you consider to be spiritual, religious, they have a direct impact on the things that you consider to be material and natural. The other side to this, or another way of putting this, and this is our transition into the next topic, is to say that the natural world and the supernatural world are in fact not two different worlds. They're one and the same. You just need to have the right perspective, the right consciousness to realize this. So the more knowledge and the more perspective you have, the more you will see this directly. And the less you have, the more you will only be fixated on the material causes of this world. The topic that I wanted to use to illustrate this point today is the field of the world of the plants. When we look at the types of life that exist and that we know, the plants constitute, to the majority of us, I think, the lowest form of life that we know concretely. When we look at plants, we don't really think of them as entities that have a lot of awareness, consciousness, feelings, personality, none of that. We see plants as, yes, they are living entities, living beings, but really they seem to be ruled by a cause and effect, action-reaction type of world. So what we wanted to do is to look at the world of plants very quickly, to look at some case studies from the world of plants, and I assure you all the examples that I will mention are taken from scientific works, books and articles published in peer-reviewed journals, people who are considered academics and PhDs in their field, respected in their field, who are talking about the world of plants, to see what we can learn from that world in relation to what we have said until now and to the next point that we want to make with all of us. The first case, and this is a build-up, we're going from the simplest to the more complex. The first case of plants, or the many cases, but the case that I'm mentioning quickly, has to do with perception. Oftentimes, the majority of us, I don't think we view plants as having a lot of perception. They have just enough to get the minerals they need, the water they need, the light they need to grow and develop and reproduce and die. I don't think the majority of us would view plants as, for instance, being able to hear what's going on. And maybe they don't hear in the sense that we understand and we hear. But there's a lot of studies that have been done to show that plants are very attuned to frequencies of 50 to 400 hertz. And specifically, if you want a plant to go in a certain direction, all you need to do is to put a frequency of about 200 hertz. That's in common parlance, the concrete way to say this is the sound that water makes when it's in a course. If you're near a river, the sound that water is making is about 200 hertz. If plants are anywhere near that type of frequency, their roots move in that direction. And they used to think before that it was only the tip, they call it the apex, the tip of the root of the plant that moves in that direction, that is able to have the sensory perception of those frequencies, but it was later established that it was the entire root. The plant is listening with its entire roots and moving it with its entirety towards that. Okay, one thing to keep in mind. Let's build on this. So when we talk about the system of communication and language, one thing is, what you receive. So this is one way the plants receive. But it has to be communication. For communication to work, you have to have a give and take. It has to work both ways, right? If we look at, there was many scientists who spent their entire lives studying bees. And in fact, some scientists received the Nobel Prize for working on the language of the bees for 40 years until he deciphered it. He understood that the movement of the bee, when it travels to a certain distance and finds flowers and pollen, it comes back to the colony and it performs a certain dance that tells the rest of the colony, based on the position of the sun, where the pollen is going to be found based on the distance and based on the direction. And they created little robots that performed those dances, and the bees that look like bees, and the bees followed them to those locations to validate, to confirm that language. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize. And this was supposed to, today when they read this and when they interpret this, they say how complex the language of the bees is in the animal world. For a bee to be able to pinpoint to all the other bees where to travel to find the flowers. Okay, but the bees can only communicate within their species. As scientists have studied plants, they saw that plants communicate way beyond just their species. They do communicate with their own species. They do communicate with all the other plants, even though they are completely different species. And they communicate with other types of living creatures, such as insects and birds and bats. The very simple way of communicating is, for instance, through colors. They don't have anything much with it. Fine. They also have the ability to attract the specific animal that they need. Bees can see ultraviolet light or rays, and this is how plants attract the bees to them. There are plants that require a specific species. For instance, there's a plant that requires bats to be pollinated. They emit clicks that only bats can hear. And they come and they eat from the plants and they can pollinate the plant. So the plant can reproduce. If we continue with this, we have plants, we're told that the corn plant is usually eaten by a type of caterpillar. If there's too much of this going on, the plant knows that it's now going to be threatened. It emits a chemical that attracts wasps who feed on that type of caterpillar to remove those caterpillars from itself. Why to attract those specific wasps? How does it know which chemical is going to attract those specific wasps? Okay, so this is to show the complexity of the communication and language of the plants. Building on this, we're told, if this is to look at the world of the perception and the protection and the intelligence of the plants, we're told that there's a type of ladybug that eats one type of plant, and I'm specifically not going in the scientific terms because it gets too heavy. There's a type of ladybug that eats a type of plant. But the eating process is very interesting. It starts by, before eating the leaves, it only feeds on the leaves of that plant. It starts by eating the place where the leaf is connected to the plant. It eats it completely, leaving it hanging by only 2 little threads. And then it feeds for about 2 hours, and then it stops. And the next day, the scientists have noticed that the ladybug shows up exactly 6 meters away from where it ate that leaf. So they went into all sorts of studies for a very long time. And they discovered that when that plant is eaten, if enough of the ladybugs are eating enough of the leaves, the plant knows that now it's under threat. There's too many leaves being eaten. It releases a toxin that makes all of its leaves poisonous. So what does the ladybug do? It doesn't allow the toxin to reach the leaf. It eats the leaf where it's hanging to the plant first, leaving it only with 2 threads, and those 2 threads don't allow enough toxin to go into the leaf so that it can eat in peace. The plant seems to realize this. So what does it do? It sends an alarm to all the plants around it, covering the area of 6 meters, to make everything around it toxic. So the ladybug can't eat anything in that area. So the next day when it comes, it doesn't feed there. It goes exactly 6 meters away to feed. Okay, so that's a very complex process. It's a sophisticated process. Maybe plants are not as simple as we may think. Let's add to this. There's a story in the plant world known as the paper factor. The paper factor is basically a group of scientists who are studying a type of insect that is supposed to, that type of insect mutates. You know, when insects come into this world, they come into eggs. And then when they hatch, it's a larva. And it metamorphoses, it goes through a metamorphosis until it reaches the adult age. It goes through 5 steps, that type of plant, that type of insect. It transforms 5 times until it reaches the adult stage. They noticed that that insect that they were studying, when it reaches the 5th stage where it's supposed to transform and become an adult, it continues to transform a 6th and 7th and 8th time, and then it dies. It stays in a state of larva. It's unable to become an adult. And this launched an obsessive study about those insects to see what's going on. And after a while, it was discovered that there's a toxin, there's a poison, that if it enters and it's part of those insects, it modifies their genetic code in a way that makes them continue to transform in the larval state and never become an adult. After a lot of study, because they did not know where this is coming from, they've isolated every element they could think of. They realized that the insects were being raised in the laboratory. They were being raised on a bedding, on paper towels, made up of a certain type of, coming from a certain type of tree. They cut those trees, and they make them into paste, and then they make paper towels from them. And those trees are the ones that produce that type of toxin if they are attacked by this specific type of bug. The problem is, this is now in a paper towel state. It's not in the tree state. And this had the scientists, and it still does, has the scientists completely bewildered. The tree is not defending itself by attacking the individual that's coming to attack it. The tree is producing a toxin that modifies the genetic code of those insects in a way that will exterminate them completely, so that they can never become adults and they can never reproduce. And then when they continued to study that forest and those trees, they saw that when the infestation stops, the trees stopped producing that toxin. And that launched into a whole series of different areas of research to see in what way are the plants defending themselves, and is this happening to human beings? And in the 1990s, there were studies that discovered that sweet potatoes can have very high levels of progesterone, and that the date fruit can have very high levels of estrone, which is a form of estrogen. Both of these are reproductive hormones found in human beings who want to procreate. And some of the scientists were saying, is this nature fighting back, feeling threatened? So it's producing the types of hormones that would prevent a human being from being able to reproduce. The same quantities that you would find in a contraceptive pill were found in those edible plants, sweet potatoes and dates. Let's go into, I'm going to skip some of the examples, we're running out of time. I want to go into the cases of feelings. We're progressing, as we said, we went from the simplest to the more complex. Do plants feel? Do they have feelings, and do they feel? And do they feel the feelings of other entities? Because these are very different levels. That you have feelings is different than you have the compassion or empathy or sensitivity to another entity's feelings. There are many cases of plants that either stop flowering or stop producing fruits, or that simply shrivel away and die because their owners or an animal that was always with them is no longer there, even though there are people who take care of them. So those are documented cases. That's one. There's now a whole field in the world called silvotherapy. Go and look it up. This has to do with, in our words, we would say it's tree hugging. Teaching people how to touch trees in a way that there's an exchange of energy, and the scientific studies are showing that it changes the cortisol levels in your body, which has to do with stress. And people who are diabetics, they can heal from it because it changes the blood pressure, the glucose levels in the blood, and other aspects of the body. If you know how to touch and where to touch and so on and so forth. For how long? So the 40 minutes touching a tree in the forest and so on and so forth. That's a whole field. Go look it up. And then there's all the work of a man by the name of Cleve Baxter. And I'm going to go a little bit faster here. Cleve Baxter is a man whose specialty, he was a specialist who worked for the who worked for the CIA as a specialist in interrogation techniques. After a while, he developed an instrument like the polygraph. One day, this man decided that he's going to connect his machine, this polygraph, let's just call it a polygraph. He connected this machine to a plant in his office because he had just watered the plant. His machine is supposed to assess or measure your heart rate, the manner, the pattern of your breathing, your arterial pressure, and through this, he can tell, with the help of the machine, if someone is lying or not, and maybe what kind of feeling the body is emitting. So are you feeling threatened? Are you feeling angry? You're able to tell that based on what the machine is telling you from the way you react during the interrogation. So he decided to hook the machine to the plant that he had just watered to see whether the plant would measure how the water would go into the plant from the soil into the leaves. Very innocent way of doing something, but that generated a 36-year fascination with plants. Because he soon discovered that the same types of spikes that you see in the polygraph machine when dealing with a human being while being interrogated, you can see in the plants. So he thought, I'm going to threaten the plant. When you have someone who's committed a crime and you're interrogating them, what they're really reacting to and what you're really looking for is the threat. If you haven't performed the act, then you're in a state of fear. But if you've performed the act, your body reacts as you're threatening me for having done something. So he went with the same mentality, and he says, I started to want to threaten the plant. So I would come to the plant, and basically I want to burn the plant and measure the spike. And there was a very big spike, the exact same type as you would find with a human being. Okay. The part that you find in the plant that you don't find in the human being is that he says, I did not put the lighter on yet. The plant reacts when I intend to turn it on fire. It's reacting to my intention. It's not reacting to the act of being burned. It's reacting to my intention of burning it. And then he went away, and he would connect the machine to the plant, and he would time the exact moment where during his walk of 40 minutes away, he would think, now I'm going to destroy the plant. And the machine is connected to the plant in his lab, and when he comes back and he checks the timing, he sees that the plant felt the spike. There is a spike in the polygraph. So the distance is not making a difference. If he's thinking about that specific plant that he wants to destroy, the plant is spiking because it feels threatened, reacting to the intention. This is all, by the way, published in a book that he published 2003. It's called Primary Perception. He called those types of things primary perceptions, and then he referred to them later as biocommunication. That was one example, the threat. He went further. Now he knows the plant understands, can react to all of this. He went further. He says we were in the lab and the plant is in a room. I went to the kitchen in another room, and I would take live shrimp and I would dump it into boiling water. And the plant spikes. So the plant is feeling that other species, that other entity being destroyed. And it's spiking and reacting to it. And then he noticed something beyond that. He says, I started noticing at that time that the plants are spiking at a time when he's doing nothing. So he starts inquiring and looking around and trying to see what's going on, maybe in the building. And strangely enough, he discovers that the plants are reacting every time the toilet is being flushed. When we go to the washroom, obviously we're releasing things from our bodies that have human cells in them. But those cells remain alive. They don't die right away. So why would they react just from flushing? So he continued to ask around and dig with an obsession until he found out that the janitors of that building are using a very strong disinfectant in the toilets to keep them very clean. So the moment people are going to the washroom, whatever you're releasing into the water is dying right away. So they're not reacting to the flushing, they're reacting to the human cells dying. And this gave him an idea. He's like, if plants are reacting this way, can we do something to see if other species are doing the same thing? So he thought, I'm going to use myself as a guinea pig. He cut the back of his hand open, and he took out blood, and he took out cells from that blood, leukocytes. And he put them in a test tube, and he connected that to the machine. And then he brought iodine to pour on his hand, a disinfectant that will obviously kill all the cells that are there. The same spike happened in the human cells that were outside of the body, sitting in the test tube. As though, that's how he interprets it, as though they're telling the cells remaining in the body, there's a threat. The cells in the body are the ones telling the ones in the test tube, there's a threat. But those sitting in the test tube are not threatened, they're outside now. But the communication seems to be ongoing. even though they're not sitting inside the body. He repeated this experiment by taking the test tube up to 100 kilometers away. And the test tube with the cells in it was still reacting when the cells inside the body were threatened. All of this is to say what? All of this is to say that perhaps the world of nature is a little bit more complicated than we may think. Perhaps the world of nature has things that we don't understand. And perhaps when we hear of things that are supernatural, we cannot just right away dismiss them and say, I don't understand this, therefore it cannot be true. It doesn't sit with what I understand and what I know of the world, so it cannot be true. Maybe we need a little bit more humility and a little bit more openness, especially given everything that we've said about the manner in which this world works and behaves. So maybe the verses of the Quran that say that everything in the world that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created is constantly in a state of sujood to Allah, but we fail to understand, maybe it's not so metaphorical after all. Maybe when the Quran says that everything that is created is in a state of praising Allah, maybe it's not so metaphorical. Maybe it's true that it's praising. The praising is actually happening, but as the Quran says literally, but you do not understand. And this is where we want to bring it back to the topic, or to the events, to the tragedy of Karbala. We know that many things, horrible things, bad things have happened in history. They have happened to prophets and messengers and saints throughout history. Bad things happened to the Holy Prophet, bad things happened to Imam Ali alayhi salam, Fatima al-Zahra, Imam al-Hassan, all the other Imams. But there's something different about the tragedy of Karbala. Hence the importance that we give to it and the weight we give to it. It's different. All the Imams have told us that it's different. And one of the ways that we know how different it is by looking at what I can refer to as the rebellion of nature around the tragedy of Karbala. Everything we have said is to come back to this punchline, to this conclusion. That if we hear that nature rebelled, that nature revolted, because the person that we refer to as the Khalifa of God on earth, the person to whom all of creation is connected. As we said, Allah says, the more you become my Khalifa, the more I make everything under your service. So what about the person who's supposed to be this perfect example of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants? How would nature react? We're saying that nature is perhaps reacting in all sorts of the ways that we see, or the Quran has told us, on a day-to-day basis, for normal sins, or for normal good acts. So what if it's the type of tragedy and the type of things that occurred, some of which we know and the majority of which we probably will never know, that actually took place in Karbala? The desecration of the sanctity of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, the open defiance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this manner. Would nature not revolt against it? And so now I thought I would give you my own summary very quickly related to this topic about how nature revolted around the tragedy of Karbala. I will not read any of the narrations. I will only tell you the theme or the heading of the narration and tell you how many narrations I have found for each one of these. So this is the nature rebelling for the tragedy of Karbala in numbers. And the reason I'm not going into the specific narrations is that someone might say, this narration is authentic, but that one is not. And this one is valid, and that one is not. Or there's a detail here that's missing there. Fine. What I want you to do about all of these is to use your common sense logic. You're sitting here and someone comes from the street and tells you something happened, a big accident happened on the street. Maybe you have doubts if one person tells you. What if 5 people tell you, independently, they're not coming together, 5 different people come? What if 20 people come? The likelihood that all of them are telling a lie at the same time is very, very low. And any commonsensical human being would say, this happened, unless I have a very strong reason not to believe that it happened. Each one of these numbers that I'm giving you is actually a report that goes back all the way to the time the incident happened. I'm not saying that each one of them is necessarily authentic, but I'm saying that you have to look at the numbers and say, is there likelihood that something happened or not? That's all we're trying to do. If someone tells you that nature revolted and rebelled for the tragedy of Karbala, given what I'm about to say in numbers, do you think that you can just dismiss? Or do you need to use your common sense and say most likely some of these must have happened? There are too many reports. And as I said, I won't read any of them right now. I'm just giving you the headings. We are told in 47 narrations, and there's something very interesting that I didn't want to get into. Many of these narrations are reported more in Sunni sources than they are in Shiite sources. And I'll highlight a couple of them. In 47 different narrations, we are told that the heavens and the earth cried for Imam al-Hussein. We are told that many of the seeds that the people were eating at that time turned into ash. We have that in 3 narrations. We have 2 narrations that tell us that the food being consumed at that time, or some of the food being consumed that was being cooked in pots at that time, turned into blood. 2 narrations. We have 14 narrations that tell us that all creatures cried for the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. We have 27 narrations, so 20 of them from Sunni sources and 17 from Shi'i sources. 27 narrations from in Islamic sources that say that jinn were heard wailing and crying for the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. We have 12 narrations saying that the angels cried, and 3 of them say that the angels descended on earth and cried. We have 11 narrations, 6 of them Sunni, 5 of them Sunni, 6 of them Shi'i. 11 narrations saying that the sand turned to blood in many locations of that region. We have 21 narrations in the Shia sources and 12 narrations in the Sunni sources that say that it rained blood in the tragedy of Karbala. We have 13 narrations, 6 of them Shi'i, 7 of them Sunni, that say there was blood under every stone that was turned around the tragedy of Karbala. We have 3 narrations that say that all the walls looked like they had been splattered with blood. We have 9 narrations that say that there was a solar eclipse the day of the 10th of Muharram, and there was a great darkness that covered the event, and people could see the stars in the middle of the day. We have 5 narrations that say that there was a light that was shining from the head, the cut head, the severed head of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, that was carried from one place to another. We have 5 narrations saying that there was a light that shone from it all the way to the middle of the sky. We have 18 narrations that say that the head of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam continued to speak and to recite Quran after it was cut for the entire time that it was cut. We have 6 narrations that say that many of the people who watched the event of Karbala became blind afterwards. We have 14 narrations that say that the participants in the tragedy of Karbala, the leaders, the commanders against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, all of them died a horrible death. We have 4 narrations that say that the bodies of those who performed these atrocities against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam emitted a horrible stench every day of their life afterwards. And we have 5 narrations that say that many of those who fought Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, their faces turned black while they were alive. And specifically, one of those people is a man by the name of Karbala. Karbala ibn Kahil or Kahin, usually they say al-Asadi. The problem with al-Asadi is that Bani Asad are a very well-known tribe. It should have been very easy to pinpoint where from Bani Asad, whom from Bani Asad he is. That's why a lot of the historians who have really looked into this man, the origin of Karbala, where he came from, they say he was actually a foreigner. He may have been called Karbala, but he's most likely not really from Bani Asad. Umar ibn Sa'd wanted to pass him as one of the Arabs, but in fact, even if you read the Maqatil and the way he behaved then, he did not really talk. They communicated with him mostly by signs, as though he doesn't really speak Arabic. In any case, that man, we are told, performed some horrible things in the event of Karbala. He was an archer. His specialty was to shoot arrows. And he shot many arrows that were very, very devastating to the side of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. In the narrations, in the narration that talks about his face turning black, there's a man who says, I was in Kufa when Karbala and the rest of the caravan came to Kufa. When they went from Karbala, they cut the heads of the companions of the Imam and his family members. We said 72 heads were cut. One of the heads was the head of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas alayhi salam. And the one carrying it into Kufa was Karbala. And the man who reports this says, I saw him enter, and he had attached a head around the neck of his horse, so that if the horse was upright, the head was hanging. But if the neck of the horse would go down, the head would be on the ground. And I asked him, whose head is this? And he told me, this is the head of Al-Abbas ibn Ali. And he says, I saw him a couple of days later, that same man. He says he was a white, good-looking man when he entered into Kufa. And when he left, he was completely dark and very ugly to look at. And I asked him, are you not the same man who entered into Kufa carrying that head? And he said, yes. So the narrator says, I asked him, what happened to you? And he started crying and saying that since I carried that head, every night I'm seeing dreams as though I am being pushed into a hellfire and I've burnt in it. And my face turned black. And now I have this black face. This is what we're told in the narrations about the blackness of the face of Karbala. When all of the companions and all of the household members of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam had been killed, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam came to bid farewell to his family, to his daughters, to his very young children, to his wives, to his sisters, and to the rest of the people in the camp. And then as he was about to leave, he asked for his very young child, his baby boy that is referred to in the ziyarat and in the narrations as Abdullah, that we call Abdullah al-Radi', because he was still a suckling infant, perhaps around 6 months old. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam took him and he sat down and he kissed him and he said, away with these people when your grandfather is going to be their opponent on the day of judgment. And then he came to the people. The narrator said it's as though he was covering something from the sun, shielding something from the sun. Then he moved his clothes and they could see that he was carrying a child. And he told them, if you don't want to give any of us any water, at least take him and feed him water and bring him back to us. This created a great commotion on the side of the enemies. Some of them said, this is just a baby, give him water. And some said, we will not give a drop of water to these people, anyone in this household, until they all die. This back and forth angered Umar ibn Sa'd. He told Harmala, end the discussion. So Harmala shot an arrow that landed in the throat of the baby and killed the son of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam while he was carrying him in his hands. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam put his hand where the blood was coming out. He filled it and then he threw it to the heavens. And this was the second blood that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam throws to the heavens, and not a single drop of it comes back down. Then Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam continues, and the narration, by the way, from the blood not coming back is reported by a number of Imams, including Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. And we have in Ziyarat al-Nahiya al-Muqaddasah, which is reported from Imam al-Mahdi ajjalallahu farajah, he describes this scene in his ziyarah. One day, inshallah, we'll go over the entirety of this ziyarah, which gives us the entire canvas of what happened in Karbala. About this specific scene, Imam al-Mahdi ajjalallahu farajah is reported to be saying, peace unto you, Abdullah. He's sending his salutations to the infant that was slaughtered. He says, peace be unto you, Abdullah, the slaughtered infant, the one shot with an arrow, the one whose blood was shed in a most cruel manner, and whose blood ascended to the heavens, the one slaughtered with an arrow in his father's lap. The curse of Allah be upon the person who shot him, Harmala ibn Kahil al-Asadi, and upon his allies. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam said at that point, what decreases my affliction at this point, what allows me to bear this calamity, is that it has happened under the watchful eye of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He knows that Allah is seeing all of this, so he can be patient. And then he says, oh Allah, it is not less in your esteem than the life of the baby of the she-camel of the people of Thamud. Lord, if you have kept victory away from us, then let it be so for something even better. And seek revenge on our behalf from the oppressors, and let what has happened to us in this life be a treasure for us in the afterlife. O Allah, you are the witness against the people who killed the one who looked most like your messenger Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him and his progeny. And this was again the second time that the Imam says this. After he said that about Ali al-Akbar, now he's saying that this child was also similar looking to the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the Imam heard in the riwayat, we are told, from the heavens a caller say to the Imam, leave him, O Hussein, for there is a nurse for him in paradise. So the Imam came down from his horse and he dug a grave to him with his sword, and he performed the rituals of the prayer over his 6-month-old child, and then he went into the battle. Assalamu ala al-Hussein wa ala Ali ibn al-Hussein wa ala awlad al-Hussein wa ala ashab al-Hussein wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.